Friends, it's really good to be with you tonight on this December evening. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to the third gathering of our 9-month cohort season. This is actually the 6th year that we've been doing this, and I was telling folks that this is our, as far as my count goes, 43rd, maybe 48th. I think maybe was the number I came up with, 48th time gathering together as the coalition, either in person or online in these monthly gatherings where we organize together. And in that time, all of those gatherings have made possible other action, right? Like this is the place where we connect in our hearts and our minds and in our spirits and in our work, but also it makes possible these other things that we're doing together. So welcome to the coalition. We're a collection and a collective of over 70 congregations and communities across the state who are discerning and learning new ways to steward our land, our people, and our money so that all Oregonians can find home. And you've heard me say it before. I'm going to say it again, though. We're part of a larger movement home that we call the Sacred Organizing House. The house brings together under one roof teams of people of faith and courageous love who are committed to building a multi-faith, multiracial, and multi-generational movement for justice in Oregon. And the thing that unites us is our shared practices of sacred organizing, because we believe that by working together, we actually can move toward a horizon of liberation, which includes racial equity, housing justice, climate resilience, and youth leadership. So this is us. We are a part of a larger whole. And tonight, we are going to continue to walk together through the sacred organizing spiral. And we are still in the part of the spiral that we call sacred encounter. But we're bridging toward the next part, which is sacred unveiling. That moment, those times when we show the world as it is so that we can do something about it and make it the world that we desire it to be. So this is where we listen to our neighbors and ourselves and our land to reveal what needs and pressures and dreams are present, because we want to be able to take action together with integrity, and that only comes through listening. We can only build collective power and move out of isolation and share real resources, people, land, money, and knowledge, and move aside barriers that stop us from making the world as it is into the world we know it's supposed to be. We can only do that if we do it by listening first. So thanks for being here. Tonight, we'll begin by learning about what we call land story, or sometimes land genealogy. My name's Jules. I use she, her pronouns. I'm one of the organizers with the Land and Housing Coalition, and the land that caught me when I was born, that held out its hands and said, here you are, was Toledo, Ohio, right on the Lake Erie. But the land of my heart is in Eastern Ohio, in a tiny town called Salem, Ohio. And the place that will catch me when I die is Greenville, Michigan. That's where all of my ancestors are buried. And those stories matter to me, and they make up who I am. And so we're going to talk about what land means to us. It's easy to forget, in part because we've been encouraged to forget, that the land that we steward as people, as individuals, and as communities is more than just acreage. It's a living story with deep roots that wind through time. And I know that if we're going to steward that land with integrity and with responsibly, we need to unveil and share those stories so we know how to take action that creates life and liberation. We need to unveil and share those stories, because how to take action means, for me, I want to not do further harm. I want to not do further oppression of the people that I want to be neighbors to and support. And so I need those stories in order to know how to do that well. Over the last few years, we've seen how core teams that learn the story of the land their people are on, their congregation perhaps, or their community, or the land that you individually come to own, quote unquote, that we all make wiser decisions about what to do on that land when we know its story. whether it's learning their specific history of the displacement of Black or Native people in order to repair some of that harm, or if it's the discovery of the hopes and dreams of the neighborhood around them. These land stories reveal the real needs and the real pressures and the real opportunities available to us as we move from seeing ourselves as owners of property to stewards of land resources. I want to say that again. When we listen to what the land has to tell us, we begin to understand how to move from seeing ourselves as owners of property to stewards of land. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz is the author of a book called An Indigenous People's History of the United States, which I suggest to you all. And she said this: everything in US history is about the land. Who oversaw and cultivated it, fished its waters, maintained its wildlife. Who invaded and stole it, how it became a commodity, quote unquote, real estate, broken into pieces to be bought and sold on the market. Everything in US history is about the land. So that's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to learn together how to build a land story that matters, how to make meaning of what we learn, and some examples of how these land stories have informed our collective action as a coalition and the decisions that we can make so we can be really honest about our land and change the future by learning from our past. So that's what we're going to be learning tonight. We have some amazing teachers among us, and one of them is going to guide us in our spiritual grounding for this evening. So I want to invite Melissa Reed to introduce herself and guide us through that. Thanks, Melissa.
Thanks, Jules. Hey, everybody. My name is Melissa Reed. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I accompany the Westminster Sacred Organizing Core Team, and I'm going to share with you my land story. A part of my land story that will not come up is that the land that caught me when I was born was Göttingen, Germany. My parents were students, theology students in Germany. But the land that nurtured and raised me was all over New England and in particular Rockport, Massachusetts. The land that caught my children was the land in Portland, which I'll talk more about. And I imagine I never thought about this, Jules, but because I long for the people that walk with me in my life to bury me in the land that has supported me, I imagine I will be buried here too. We are the Land and Housing Coalition, and the land of this title feels really important to me because first, when we are organizing around housing, we are discerning place and space and who gets to belong. And having physical place and land with which to make life is a part of the ability of human beings to just be, to exist, and make belonging with others. Land is life, as Jules has named, that we are in relationship with. And we are discerning how to be faithful stewards of that land, which we did not create. I want to say that again. We are not the creators of the land. We are not tiny gods of the land. The land is sacred creation, and we are sacred creation in mutuality. And when we don't honor that, our life together breaks down. But commodification of life pretends otherwise. And capitalism and systems of white supremacy not only commodify life, when they do, they erase our memories of that life. And if it's an object, it can't have memory, right? But if it is life, it must have memory. So if land is property, the story it tells is one of monetized value, wealth that some people get to benefit from, and those who don't have it don't. But my faith tells me a different story. The ancient stories of my faith remind me that spirit breathes through all creation. And what happens when we remember land as not an object for some, but rather land as life that bears the life of communities, past, present, leading us to our future? Does not land always have a story within it that is worth telling? And might that story disrupt our patterns of mindless objectification? And like all life, might the land carry the power of spirit within her to move and inspire us in faithful ways that honor and dignify this life and even repair the harm we've done through objectification? So I'm about to share my family's land story. By attending to the story of land in our family, I have a more whole narrative of how I come to be in this world, in this place, with the privilege and pain that I bear, and how I am being called in this world in new, more life-affirming ways. As you are listening to this story, I invite you to just contemplate what parts touch your story, your family's story, or move you to want to know more. Okay? What parts touch your family's land story? And what parts move you to want to learn more? So I offer this story with a deep sense of humility, as it is unfinished, and I am still in the process of learning and unlearning. Until then, I could just live under the simplistic story that we were Irish immigrants and life was hard, but we made it. These are the words of my mother. I'm on a FaceTime call with her. Her name is Kathleen O'Keefe Reed this spring, embarking on a journey inspired by this work to do my own familial land genealogy. Namely, what has been the relationship with the story of land in our family, and what difference has that made? Mom is recounting the experience 20 years earlier of receiving documents that her maternal grandmother, Beulah May Reynolds, had collected on her quest to become a daughter of the American Revolution. The document is the will of an ancestor, a man by the name of Bayerly, from the later 1700s. The word Bayerly is German and a low way to say Bavaria. Bayerly is a landowner in Virginia, and this will provide, and these documents provide for the manumission of some slaves upon his death, but not all. Some human beings are passed on along with the land to his children. This comment from my mother sums up my experience of my entire family's approach to the memory of our ancestral roots. Convenient amnesia. Over the last year, as I've started to feel my way back through my familial bloodlines, I've discovered that we are immigrants. I know, as a white person in the US, not a surprise at all, duh. However, I have lines and roots back to lands and cultures I had no idea were ours. And they aren't as distant in most cases as I assumed. Mary Ann Stewart, my father's paternal great-grandmother, arrived in New England from Scotland in the 1880s. Michael and Bridget O'Keefe, my mom's paternal great-grandparents, left Ireland in the 1880s as well, landing in West Virginia, then making their way to New Jersey. A man named Phelps, a Lutheran pastor, the first German immigrant from my father's paternal line, settled in Pennsylvania. And in every case, it seems, land was available to them almost immediately. They came seeking land, some stripped of land or becoming scarce in their own homelands. My family has owned land in Massachusetts, Maryland, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Indiana, Kansas, and yes, now in Oregon. And in at least one case, we owned people, Black siblings. And that's how we built our wealth that was passed on down the generations, participating in and benefiting from the objectification and commodification of life, land, and human. My parents' education that contributed to our livelihoods and middle-class reality was paid for by their families, and my folks received down payment support for nearly every home they purchased throughout their 50 years of marriage. My ancestors left homelands and crossed oceans due to famine and political upheaval, and in the United States, we benefited from the spirit of manifest destiny and generations of violence and colonization, genocide and removal of indigenous peoples, and exclusion laws that affirmed our whiteness as we quickly shed our identity beyond American. I now hear the stories we tell differently. When we cheer that I am the fourth generation of women in my family to have a college degree, as I reflect on the experience of many of my siblings of color, I also hear the immense privilege that story drips with. And why was my maternal great-grandmother so interested in proving herself to be a daughter of the American Revolution? It wasn't to participate in repair. As I questioned the thinness and amnesia of our stories, I learned we knew more than we told. I learned that she came from a working-class family. She grew up on a 40-acre farm in Battleground, Indiana. And what were Black Americans afforded when they were emancipated? 40 acres and a mule. She knew that, and she knew that my great-grandfather's family looked upon their match as a class step down. My heart breaks that she felt the need to prove her worth and distance herself from the pain of siblings with whom she could have found solidarity and healing. Also, if I hadn't moved beyond the half-truths and convenient myths of my family, I would have missed that while on one side of my mother's maternal line, they made their wealth enslaving human beings, an obituary revealed another branch of my maternal line, a man named Perry, was an investor in the Underground Railroad. Both and. As I stand here in what is known as East Portland, on land that my partner and I purchased in 2016, where we make our life with our 2 children and 2 pups, I feel the power and flow of these bloodlines that have brought me to this place, now known as Oregon and the Willamette Valley. The rush of my ancestors' stories collide and pool within me, creating pressure and passion and energy. They were colonizers and capitalists, enslavers and steel mill management who crossed picket lines, otherwise known as scabs. They were courageous immigrants seeking safe refuge and abolitionists seeking dignity and justice. I am them and they are me. I am a Lutheran pastor. My daughter's name is Bridget too, and I wouldn't have this education, own this land without their whole stories behind me. They were children and siblings, parents and neighbors. They were nearly all people of faith, and that faith was passed down to me too. As I reflect on our familial amnesia and this process of seeking a more whole narrative, I hear Jesus' words, "Do this and remember me." Remember me. As he breaks and shares the bread with his community on the eve of his crucifixion by the state. Jesus' call convicts me. I feel the tension of the half-truths we have told, how we made ourselves out to be saint, omitting the sinner. I remember that the mystery of the incarnation reveals that all life is God's clothing, the land, the waters, all creatures and people sacred. All parts of our story are God's own, and we need not deny any of it. The tension, pressure, energy of the whole of where I come from and who I am moves me to find my feet and the land beneath them, not only property, but sacred living earth with stories to tell. This is not my land. This is the land of the Multnomah and the Kalapuya, the names of peoples my mouth is just learning to say. Because I am here, many of them are not. I am moved to learn the whole story of this land and her peoples through the generations, and how I might use the privilege and benefit my story affords me toward healing of those harmed and excluded from the land. And how this healing may also heal me, broken apart and fractured by colonization and white supremacy from my siblings and my soul. Do this and remember me. It's a small, imperfect step, but my partner and I recently, through a local nonprofit, built an ADU on the land we live on to try to create affordable housing so that perhaps another family who could not otherwise have place could come home, find refuge, and make life here too. After all, this is not my land. It is God's body broken open and shared. As I continue to remember, I wonder how else the truth might move me, might move us, and how else we will be put back together. Thank you for receiving my family's land story. I would love it if you would take a moment and just check in with your heart and what your heart is remembering, what part of the story that I shared perhaps touched or moved you, and why. And let's just take a moment to note that in the chat. What part of my story, my family's land story, touched you? And write that in the chat. Maybe it's because it's similar to your story, or maybe there's a tension point that is gnawing at you. So there's some connection points already of like where my story touched others. Surely noticing the pain of truth telling, curiosity about the role of owning human beings in our stories. That we are both and. How convenient it is to have personal and family amnesia. The both and of, again, our backgrounds and stories and the tension. I'm just going to let you take a minute to continue to read Privilege and Responsibility, the assimilation that had to happen to make it in this country that someone's curious about. And I just want to name that Judy said that like some of us don't get to know parts of our stories because of our history and we can't go back that far. And that's absolutely true. And that is also part of your story. And so part of our stories are what we get to know and what we get to find. And the parts of our stories we don't get to know because they weren't told or we were not allowed to maintain them. And that is a part of your story. So let's keep that in mind. Thank you. I started doing my familial land genealogy because it felt connected as we were starting to do land genealogies of our faith communities. I wanted to better understand as I learned about how congregation had come to own land, and the power and the privilege that's contained in that. I wanted to better understand how that role of land ownership played out in my story. But we do this in relationships to the lands we steward because again, they can speak truths into our they are part of our story. The lands that we are on are part of our story. How we got there is a part of those generations of stories. And again, that land has voice to speak in how we might be being called as people of faith and courageous love to take actions of healing and repair and belonging. So I want to name that this process of doing a land genealogy can take time, and you can be doing this alongside the other aspects of organizing that you're going to be up to. So there's some key beats in a land genealogy, and we'll be sending you with a worksheet that you will get to dig in a deeper level. But these are the key beats of what we mean when we say, we invite you to do a land genealogy to learn the generational stories of your land. So the first question is about the who. Who are the communities that made life on the land before your faith community did. What was their life like? They had full lives. They were both and. What can you learn about who they were? What was their pain and joy, their struggle and resilience? The second question we ask once we start to learn some of that history of the various communities that came before is, why are these communities no longer here? Okay. What were the systems, structures, and policies that impacted their moving? There is usually a public story. That means it relates to the systems and structures we share and live within, that of why people moved. There was usually pressure. Where does that pressure coming from? What was at play? And who benefited from that? Who got to come next? And ultimately, who, quote unquote, owns the land now? The third kind of beat in our movement is alongside the why people were moved, why did some people never get to live there at all? So I call this the public why not. What communities never had the opportunity to make life there? Who is missing from our history? What were the systems, structures, and policies that impacted this, that excluded people? And who benefited from those policies and structures and systems? Finally, our why. Why are we here? When did the land become property in its story? And how did we come as a community to own, or an organization to own the land? Where did that wealth come from? And again, some of this desire I've had to understand my own land story is understanding that land equals wealth in this country's story. And I wanted to know, where did my wealth come from, and the wealth that I'm contributing to my faith community that sustains this ownership, but also can sustain real stewardship and actions of repair. So those are some key beats, and I would love to invite Erin Martin forward to join me, Pastor Erin Martin from Fremont United Methodist Church, because her faith community has done this work, and she's going to get to share a little bit about. First of all, Erin, welcome. Thanks. Erin, would you share with me and the group a little bit about what were about asking these questions in your land genealogy process as Fremont United Methodist Church in Northeast Portland? What were some of the really powerful pieces that you learned?
Thank you. And it's so good to be here. My name is Erin Martin. I use she, her pronouns. I am pastor at Fremont Methodist in Inner Northeast at Northeast 27th and Fremont. We did our land genealogy as a part of the very first Reckoning with Racism cohort. So we all remember the murder of George Floyd in 2020 and all that was bubbling up and bursting out in the city of Portland. And our congregation was feeling the urgency, the necessity to have a response. So we had a core team that participated in that first Reckoning with Racism. And I remember the first time this assignment, the land genealogy, was offered to us. And many of us there were confused in some ways by this assignment. What does this have to do with anything? And our desire to kind of move to action and to get out into the streets. And it was, I think, disorienting for us as a core team, and it took us time. So I just want to say that if you are a core team and you're wondering why first a land genealogy, you're not alone. Many of us have wondered why. Second, if it takes a while, give it the time it requires. It took us from about October or maybe December, as you all are getting the assignment, until late May of the next year. And to come to our land genealogy. And then we held our house meeting as a congregation. And that story, time and making and process has moved in us and with us for now over 2 years. And we had no idea then how it would ripple and move through us and change us. And we still don't know as we continue to feel the ripples of how our land genealogy has affected us. What we learned is that we are on the ancestral and unceded land of Multnomah and Cowlitz, Cathlamet, other bands of the Chinook. We learned in partnering with a local historian, Doug Decker, that there was a Chinook village not far from where we are located on Northeast 42nd. We learned that because of the Alameda Ridge, there was often a predominant trail that went from the villages on Northeast, what is now Northeast 42nd, to the river, meaning that the early Chinook bands would have walked right in front of our current congregation. And then it was a part of our discovery that our land was later a part of the Oregon Donation Land Act. That is the act that whereby white colonial settlers were given by donation 320 acres. And if they were married, it was 640. So we are on the William and Elizabeth Irving land grant. And that was essentially taken and given to white settlers and then sold. And the United Methodist Church purchased the land in the early 1920s. We also learned that Alameda was billed as it was platted as the tuxedo of Portland. And therefore really designed to be a highly residential, affluent, and in the Western European style. So the architecture is Tudor, as is the architecture of our church. And all of that was intentional and therefore had restrictive covenants forbidding the sale of any property in our neighborhood to African Americans or Chinese. It was designated as a green space. If you know the real estate redlining maps of Portland, namely as a highly desirable because it was predominantly single family. And what all that meant for us and what that has continued to mean for us is much of what is resonating from your personal land story, Melissa, namely that how we know that we came to occupy the land is not neutral. And it is tied to bigger narratives and to bigger stories, the state of Oregon, the industries of real estate, and all these ways in which intentionality brings us to where we are right now. It propelled us into a land acknowledgement that we say every single Sunday. And it is because in many ways we had to come to terms with long before we were. Our Chinook and siblings walked before us on the land. And it has led to many other kind of rippling effects. We were in the midst of the pandemic. We weren't even occupying our building at the time. And given our land genealogy, it radically changed how we returned to our space. When we finally got back to our building, it was a clear indication of humility and repentance and changing our orientation to how we were in our space and viewing our space as a congregation. And so we have shifted really intentionally to being a place that feels open to neighbors and using our opportunity to tell our story as a congregation to our neighbors, because many of our neighbors themselves don't understand the lineage of what Alameda represents, if that makes any sense. It meant changing some spaces. We had a conference room that was named after a realtor who participated in all the restrictive covenant. So we had to shift that room. We removed his name and understood that story as being implicated in the restrictive covenant real estate markets of Alameda. And we had our centennial celebration at Fremont in October of 2023, and we completely changed our understanding of how we would celebrate our 100 years, again with a deep sense of humility and a deep sense of, while we can honor parts of our past, we have to truth tell about our past, and then that truth really then orients us differently toward a future. Many of those things have continued to reverberate through us as a result of our land genealogy.
Thank you, Erin. We are going to get to hear in a minute some more stories of the impact that land stories have had or are having on how we discern life-giving reparative action through our land stewardship. But thank you so much. I know that your story is not over, that story continues to move you, and we look forward to hearing what further action it takes.
Yeah, if I might just say very quickly, what that is looking like for us is organizing around wealth redistribution. Because Fremont is not necessarily located on acreage, we don't have a parking lot. We are very condensed. What it has meant is that we are working with Housing Solidarity PDX to take responsibility for the wealth that we've earned over land ownership through the years, and redistributing some of that acquired wealth for Black and Indigenous home ownership.
So that's a way your ancestral familial land story can intersect with your community's land story and move you to some pretty powerful places. Thank you. I'm going to pass it to Chris and LaVeta.
Hello, everyone. I am LaVeta Gilmore Jones, and I use she, her pronouns. And the land that gave me birth originated in Africa. It came to the Americas and ended up in Portland, Oregon. And it's the land that has also given birth to my children. And Chris?
Hi, I'm Chris De La Cruz. I'm a pastor at Westminster, and as well as the land that caught me when I was born was New Jersey, with the soundtrack of Bruce Springsteen, Coming from the Shore, and the land where my heart stretches through memory and my ancestors is a series of islands halfway across the world that hundreds of years ago, King Philip decided to call the Philippines, over against the will of the folks who were originally there, as well as a land that was deemed resourceful for the United States of America in its own colonial purposes. And that's where my parents came from. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Chris. Well, friends, Chris and I are here at Warner Pacific. We want to share some analysis of the Barbie's Village action that took place on the 3rd of November. And Chris, can you just real briefly kind of tell us what Barbie's Village is and what action was taken by the Presbytery?
The Barbie's Village, which many of you have been a part of and organizing stemmed from basically this vision from a coalition of Indigenous organizations, Future Generations Collaborative, with this vision for a tiny home village and early childhood center for Indigenous families with children, about 6 to 10 tiny homes that they've been holding for a number of years, this vision. And the relationship with Levin, then partnered with Westminster Presbyterian Church, one of the core teams here, partnered to work with the Presbytery of the Cascades, basically the Presbyterian Church's like local thing, a group of various congregations around Oregon, to have the Presbytery give, in the spirit of land back, give land to back to Indigenous folks for this vision. And just the presbytery process alone took about 2 years. And in November, with many of you supporting and organizing and cheering on, the Presbytery of Cascades voted yes for land back for Barbie's village.
Okay, in that vote, was it just a straightforward vote?
Like I said, it took 2 years. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, it was not a straightforward vote. But because of the relationship building we did, 85% of the folks voted yes, but not without some stuff.
Right, not without some stuff, right. And I was observing that meeting, and as I noticed, there was some amendments that were put forth, or an amendment that was put forth, that seemed to kind of create tension around, there was the desire to have a land back, but there was some tension around the fact that this was land that was had a monetary value, and that there was some fiduciary concerns around how this was all going to happen. And as I was listening to this, and you and I were talking about it afterwards, I was like, wow, something was stirring in me, really was stirring in me. It was like, here we have this desire to do land back, and yet this issue of moneyed land and fiduciary responsibility keeps cropping up. And it's not just, in the situation with Barbie's Village, but this has also cropped up in other congregations and churches. And I was like, I need to get to the bottom of this. What is really going on? And this isn't about framing people as being good people and bad people, but this is about something deeper. And so I started doing a little research, and I finally came upon, everyone's heard this thing, the doctrine of discovery, right? But when I actually looked into it, I found that the doctrine of discovery wasn't just one thing. It was 3 different edicts from 2 different popes over almost a 50-year period of time. And so then I really decided to delve into it a little bit more and discovered, in 1452, the Pope was considered, to be like a directly connected to God. So power came from the Pope. He was seen as having divine authority from God. And the Pope granted power to the King of Portugal. He put forth this decree that propagated a spiritual worldview that actually is in opposition to the teachings of Jesus. But at that time, that's not how it was seen. He felt that he was putting forth a worldview that would defend and increase the Christian faith. And in defending and increasing the Christian faith, it meant that the savages, the excesses of the Muslims who had brought, the Moors had brought the Muslim religion to Spain and Portugal. He needed to restrain that and name them as infidels and enemies of Christ and of the Christian faith, and that they needed to be diminished, demonized, and vanquished because they were not Christian and because they were non-European. And so with that, something has happened. You have this Pope who has power, supposedly from God, giving the king power, conferring that power upon the king. And the emphasis on that is that the European Christian body now holds inherent spiritual worth because it bears the full image of God. And the king, as an image of the bearer of God, has the right to determine what is right and just. Now that's in 1452, right? So now we have non-European bodies and non-Christian bodies don't have agency before God. They are therefore, it's okay to conquer and to enslave. And the king was granted the privilege to discover land that, although it was occupied by someone else, it was still discoverable. And that king could pass this land on to his children and to his people and his successors. So that first decree was given to King Alfonso V in Portugal. And I was just blown away when I was reading parts of it, and it said he had the right to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Muslims and pagans, enemies of Christ, and the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, movable and immovable goods that they possessed, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. What do you think? And then in 1454, the second edict was granted. And that was the edict that said that the European Catholic nations could expand dominion over discovered land, even though you can't discover land that is already inhabited. And then the third edict was issued in 1493 by Pope Alexander IV to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabel of Spain. And it affirmed the state-sanctioned expedition and work of conquest by Christopher Columbus. And it affirmed the spread of Christian rule. So I was thinking, you know, in American culture, we talk about white supremacy, but we aren't really taking a look and understanding that this was a spiritual worldview that was blessed by the Pope, imparted to the kings to set up nations and colonies. And the impact of that is ongoing today. It's ongoing today. And I was wondering, you know, the impact of that on Native Americans is that they were viewed then as not bearing the image of Christ, as needing to be corrected and tutelaged, and property laws were shaped and legalized. And actually the doctrine of discovery was the precedent that was used in 1831 that basically said Native peoples could occupy land, but that because of this doctrine of discovery, the government had the sovereign right to extinguish Indian interests in their land, either by purchase of war or war. And that was when it was really then became a legal instrument that has become the bedrock of legal principle for defending and defining land titles in the US. So we see now, you know, in Melissa's story, she talks about how, you know, land grants happened. In Pastor Erin's story, she talked about the Oregon land grant and the talk about the restrictive covenants, but all of that can trace its roots back to this doctrine that was declared in 1452. That's mind-blowing to me. How does that sit with you?
Well, where it sits specifically, and then thinking through Barbie's village and the ripple effects, it felt like throughout the process that, you know, in all that you said, it that constructs a play and a script that even today, folks, knowingly or unknowingly, are getting this script and playing those parts. Mm-hmm. Whether it was, you know, for the organizing work that many of us here at Leaven were a part of in terms of organizing around the neighbors, and where kind of this resistance around who gets to belong in that neighborhood comes from. Well, you know, Laurelhurst was one of those neighborhoods that had those racial covenants that said the only folks who could own land and property were white folks unless they were servants. Like, it's, you know, right? It literally said that. Many of the anxieties that you alluded to in the presbytery, I think it's easy when you're in it to kind of vilify individual humans, and that's not to not hold individual people accountable, but even, you know, it feels like more, of course, in the script of the play that was given, the church, the white church, is, you know, in touch with, you know, God's, you know, inner being, and is the one that is most blessed, and so they are the ones who can best hold on to this property. And so even if there's this saying of a spirit of repair and reconciliation, which you think presumably is part of the narrative of church in the Christian tradition, there still felt like very much a sense of a test of, like, are these certain people worthy of being able to take care of this property, right? Even though this is being supposed to be done in the spirit of repair, and two, of course, done in relationship with folks with whom have had a pretty big track record throughout the county, and honestly, even the state, in terms of relationships with folks and stewarding lots of money, actually, and a sense of like, you know, this evoking of scarcity thinking, of like the only way that the church can survive is to kind of grip as much as we can, even though we say we're actually about grace and giving. And that's part of the script that is being held of, well, the white church deserves the land, right? Because of all that you have said. And so what we collectively have tried to do, and this includes, you know, folks within the presbytery, is to go off script, is to, well, have faith, if you will, that there is a narrative beyond the play that we've been given. Yeah.
Yeah, it's to actually live in the teachings of Jesus, of the faith, of whatever the faith that guides you, that we are all children of God, that we all are inherently worthy, and that we can move with love and justice, and that we can have healing, and that repair can happen. But it means, what are we willing to let go of? And what are we willing to embrace? And I appreciate it when Erin said, we can tell our story, but the truth doesn't have to be a truth of shame. It can be a truth that leads us to liberation. And I think that that's the one thing that the vote, shows, that we can walk in liberation, that we don't have to be held in bondage, that we can be freed from that bondage. But it does take commitment. It takes paying attention to the emotions that arise. It takes paying attention to relationships and developing and nurturing those relationships of trust so that we can move forward. So that's what I noticed in that meeting. I think it was because of the strong relationships, the trust that had been built, that the presbytery was able to say, yes, we will do this, no matter what the script of 500 years has told us. We can break that script. So thank you just for sharing that reflection.
Thank you.
Jules.
Wow. I'm going to invite the room to take a breath. Between Melissa's story, complexity, entanglement, millennia, nuance, and the experience of LaVeta and Chris as they've been in the midst and the mess of systems that press in on all of the people involved in them, and even some who didn't consent to being pressed in on. A pause. We all reside on land that is in the midst of this struggle, right? So thanks, LaVeta and Chris, for letting us into the inside of what that Barbie's Village process has been like for you two, and for some of the beloveds that have been in it, and the deep history. It's not just one place in Laurelhurst. The deep history. It's all of our places. So thank you for that. And thank you for your willingness to be in it. We're all in it. Friends, I'm going to invite you right now into an opportunity to be together in one-to-ones. And the questions, of course, as you can imagine, are related to what we've just discussed. So you're going to be organized in groups of 2, and you're going to have 10 minutes to answer these questions in your conversation. If you aren't comfortable with one-to-ones, I want to ask you to take a risk, because organizing is about relationship and about the willingness to take that opportunity to be in relationship with people who you might not feel comfortable with, right? We're going to randomly assign you with folks in the language that you chose. And for the folks in person gathered, especially in East County, I know that you're in a couple of locations. Just use this time to be in dyads, in pairs, in your own place. And we invite you to participate in these one-to-ones. So I'm going to put these questions in the chat for you, which are the one-to-one conversation that I would invite you to have. One is just tell the other person about the places that you come from or call home. Maybe you want to start with the land that birthed me, the place that holds me now, and the place that will carry me home, right? Thanks, Des. One-to-one. I'll make sure that that's set up, and you might just have a delay as we let you be in your one-to-ones as a group for the youth collective. So tell me about the places you come from or call home. How did you arrive there? How did you arrive there? How did you get to that place? And then who or what else, if you know, has called that place home? Those questions are both in the chat. Many of you will be sent into rooms with 2 people. And I will, if for those of you who that might be true for, we'll make sure that you get shuffled properly, but we're going to send you in for 10 minutes. And when we come back, we're going to process not only Chris and LaVeta's conversation, but also Melissa and Erin's and your time in your one-to-one. So you'll have 10 minutes. You'll get a little bit of a warning when you're at 9, and we'll bring you back at that point. That 10 minutes went really fast. I felt it. So if you need to continue that conversation with your person, I encourage you to reach out to them directly in the chat and set up a way to do that. But I want to give us a time now as we move into the next month of work around this, of organizing ourselves around our land and our land story. I want to give you all the opportunity to ask some questions about this process. As Erin said, you can come out of this and feel like, woo, I need to debrief this. I need to ask some things. So I'm going to put some questions in the chat right now. And here are what they are. So land them either in the chat and we'll talk through them, or raise your hand and you and I can talk. What are the questions you're curious about or starting to wonder about related to your own land? What's a question that's sparking? Or what questions do you have about building a land story, like the process of it, for yourself or your core team? I see Allison from Theophilus just said, what resources do you recommend starting with? Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. We are going to send out, if you all are registered and are linked to the newsletter, I will send out to everyone on this screen who is registered a guiding document for what questions to ask and how to move forward. Your companion can help you, your team can work on it, and some other resources that will help you. But as far as technically, like where do we look for these things? There are a couple of places I know to look. One is the people with a long memory in your place, neighbors, congregation members, people who might know things that are 1 step beyond you, 2 steps beyond you. This is a one-to-one opportunity. Ask questions, get curious, ask what they know that you don't know. 2, the stories of your place are embedded in many instances in the things that your place has written down. And as Chris and LaVeta said, those stories are often one-sided. So start to read or find those stories and then start to ask curious questions about who's missing, what's missing, who isn't present in those stories, and then you'll know where to go. The third place is just really practical, and that's places like the Oregon Historical Society and Google and books, right? You can learn these things from the world. But start with people before you go to the easy and very comfortable place of abstract intellectualism. Go to human stories first. What else comes up? Who's got a question or who's thinking about this right now? And I'm sensitive to the East County folks who might not be able to easily raise their hands. So make sure that you get in there if you're wrestling with something, because I don't want to leave you out.
We just have a suggestion. Sorry, we have you way up here.
Yeah.
We just have a suggestion to check out the library.
Yes, you mean your congregational library or the library of the local place where you are?
Yes.
Yes,
the latter.
both. Yes, good. The library is a wonderful place to learn some of this. Some of you might find, I know my own congregation and our own core team found this to be true, that we had to start closest to ourselves before we could kind of leap the flagstones back to the history. Otherwise, we went too far back in time and disembodied ourselves from that actual story. So take one step at a time. And I also think that, you know, Melissa and LaVeta and Chris and Erin talked about this. Really ground yourself in the physical place. It took me personally walking around the place that I was responsible for to start to ask questions. Why is it that the people on the street behind us are all one race and the people on the street across the way are all a different race? Why? Right? So to physically look at the place where you are. Irvin, a good question. We know our land was donated. The question is why? Right. It might be lost to time, but I bet it isn't. The truth is, congregations, especially white congregations, are great at documentation. So we might be able to discover that if we are really careful researchers. Chelsea asked, what can encourage people to share and research the real stories of their land and their families? Chelsea, can you say more about what you mean by real? Because you highlighted that, and that's really helpful.
I just wanted to like highlight Melissa's story because it really resonated with me, you know, like she just found out of like her roots, like they immigrated to the US or America. Cool. So from there, like talking more about where she was born and also talking more about where she is now.
Yeah.
So like investigating more about that, you know, and also she started talking about some people who kind of just like kind of erasing a little bit of her background and kind of the stories. So how is Melissa's story going to be able to encourage others if we share it to other people outside this meeting? I'm going to encourage them to just like, you know what, let me research into my family, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about.
So real is about personal, right? It's about not abstract, not about only the larger. It's about like how we land. I know for me doing some of this work, it wasn't until I like told stories like Melissa did, where I could weave together all of the people and the lineages that were mine before I was able to kind of make sense of what questions to ask. So for some of you, before your team does this work, you might want to individually take a couple of hours to think about, what do I already know about myself? How did I end up here? How did I personally end up in this place and on this land? And that will help you ask some good questions.
Maybe I would add briefly to the realness of that, too, though, the willingness to uncover hard truths. And I think it's, if you're one or two steps removed, it feels easier. Like, what I mean, I guess in very real terms, like if you look through your own community story and find something that like a grandfather of the person in that sits in the pew was part of something like that doesn't align with your values, that's hard because you like know the people or the families, um and a commitment or figuring out, or I guess my question is, what are some practices to help kind of deal with and not want to shy away from that, or like the biography that, you know, the kind of a longtime congregant wrote, like omitted this key thing because it, you know, and you unveil what that key thing is, you're like, ooh, you know, like what. Yeah, I'm wondering if there's some practice. Yep.
I mean, one thing that comes to mind for me is just a deep commitment to truth telling, right? And to not continuing the practice of hiding things. The other thing is like, some of us, depending on our religious tradition, have real practice with repentance and with ritual. What are the rituals? What are the repentance practices that can come up and be developed even anew in a new time to work with the pain, the suffering, the reality of what has happened that we are not, as some people have said, at fault for, but responsible for. Not at fault for, but responsible for, right? So when you all are doing your land genealogy, your land story work, one of the healing practices, one of the most important things that I've seen core teams do is develop a ritual around recognizing what has happened. Not to fix it, not to change it, but to mark it. And then to know how to act from there. What does that look like? Amy asks a really good question. Do we want to be serious about our confession? Not sure. Fair hermeneutic of suspicion, Amy. But like, do we want to be serious about that confession? So know that your companions can ask you some of these questions, help you reach out to your organizers. If you're like, I don't know how our core team does this, I don't know what our first steps are, no problem. We will help you. But this is a great way to know how to move, right? It'll shape your orientation and your horizon and give you personally and collectively a way to move. And all of us, because some of you might discover, as Erin has with her story about Fremont, as Barbie's village has, might discover actually our specific story can move lots of people. And that's important. All right. We're at 8 o'clock. I am going to stop us for a moment, and I want us to just move into next steps and assignments. So LaVeta, if you can share that slide, that would help me out. I'm going to turn it over to LaVeta to make sure that we know what's happening next.
For the next step, our next gathering will be on January the 4th from 6:30 to 8 o'clock on this same Zoom link. And at that time, we'll be learning about cutting, threading, and determining actions. All right. Also, please mark March the 10th on your calendar. Save the date. This will be the date for our annual Sacred Organizing Action Assembly. And some of you may remember we gathered last year, and there were over 400 of us at that assembly last year. So mark your calendars for March the 10th. We will not have a coalition cohort teaching in March. Instead, we will be at the assembly. Also, the homework for this month is to work as a team to begin writing your land story and/or to engage the kinship with land meditation that we will send to you. And ask your companion for support, as Jules has said, and every team will have the opportunity to share your story by the end of this year. And I'd like to offer congratulations to both Aloha United Methodist and to St. Andrew's Episcopal for being funded to open their safe rest villages. Woo! Both of these teams have been working so hard and persuading their neighbors to support this work in the last year. So let's celebrate with them. Unmute yourselves just for a moment and give them a woo woo.
Woo!
Hey!
Huzzah!
Okay. And it is a giving season. And so I would encourage you and ask you to consider making a financial contribution to the coalition to support our organizing work for the year, and your gift supports the salaries of our organizers. And sign up for the coalition newsletter to receive team resources. We have 11 YouTube channel, and you can see videos of past gatherings on that, and anything else. So just sign up for the newsletter so you can get that information. I am going to take myself off of the shared screen now. And I just want to say one more time, happy holidays. I know this is the first day of Hanukkah. Happy Hanukkah to our Jewish siblings if you are here with us tonight. May you all have a blessed holiday season, and we look forward to seeing you on January the 4th. Be well.
See everybody in a month, and for those of you gathering, see you very soon. Very soon.